Oh, hello, folks. We are here again to the second hour of week 12. Okay, Scrogg. Let me see here. Robin Scrogg concludes that there is no substance to the charge that Paul was an eternal enemy of woman. On the contrary, he finds support in the letters for an enlightened or even liberationist view. Scroggs argues that Paul proclaimed the complete equality within the community of all people and groups, especially Galatians 3:27, 28, the what's that? Baptismal formula. We have threefold equality there, as we discussed. Distinctions between groups remain. The distinctions, whether you are a man or a woman, or a Jew or Greek, the distinction remain. However, values and roles built upon such distinctions are destroyed. So, men and women, you will still be a man, still be a woman, but that doesn't mean that you are superior or you are inferior in Paul's church. So this doesn't work, and this remains. Every human being is equal before God in Christ. Thus, before each okay, you know what? Let me. Thus, each other. Scroggs also notes that Paul lists women among his co-workers and alludes to a number of women who are active, presumably as leaders in the church. So in Romans 16, Paul mentions about 16 or so church leaders, and among them you have Priscilla, female disciple, and Anya, a female apostle. So women in Paul's church, women were able to become church leaders, right? Elaine Pagels has expressed reservations about Scroggs' argument. Although Paul can say that slaves are free in Christ, he quite obviously does not challenge that institution of slavery. That is true. Paul didn't challenge the institution of slavery. In a similar way, Paul's affirmation that women are equal does not mean that he is challenging the social structures. Yeah, obviously, Paul was not challenging the social structures that perpetuate their present subordination. Yeah, that's the limit. That's the limit of Paul, right? So we have to accept that. As the scholarly debate over Paul's view over women continue, much remains unresolved. But the discussion has produced some positive fruit. The conventional picture of Paul as a culture-bound male chauvinist has collapsed. This is not Paul under close investigation. In many ways, Paul's views contradict those of his Jewish background. Somehow Paul was radical from Paul appears radical from his Jewish colleagues. For example, a woman in Christ could consecrate her marriage with an unbelieving husband has no Jewish precedent. He plainly expects that women will take an active role in worship and witness the church. Active role and witness the church. So very positive. Moreover, the even-handed way that Paul addresses both men and women in 1 Corinthians 7 is instructive. In 1 Corinthians 7, Paul treats men and women equally, and he gives an even-handed treatment of the issues there. Okay. This equal share of responsibility. Men and women, they need take a responsibility for their actions. A portion to each suggests at least approximate equality in the partnership, proximity of quality in the partnership. That's somewhat revolutionary from Paul's contemporaneous, people's perspective. He's revolutionary from Jewish perspective and a Greek perspective in his own time. Maybe not in our time, but in his own time, definitely he was a revolutionary. Also, 1 Corinthians 11-16, we discussed that before, may appear Paul's compromise to his cultural expectation of gender roles, but it seems clear that Paul lays a heavy burden both on male and female to preserve the order of the church. The order of the church is more important than the cultural expectation. But the cultural expectation was male, superior, female, but from Paul's perspective, you need to cooperate. In this way, Paul appears still radical from his cultural perspective, normal cultural perspective. Some degree of subordination may be taken for granted, but it is often overlooked that Paul's main point is the distinction between the sexes, not the dominance of one over the other. So Paul doesn't want male to dominate a female, but distinction. Male should be a male, female should be a female. Okay. It's true that Paul's gospel makes many structures of the present world seem unjust, but it does not overtly call for their abolition. Paul does not challenge the social structure of his own time radically. So the question is it fair to criticize Paul for not challenging the structures of discrimination against women or the oppressive nature of slavery? Not challenging? Do we not impose our 21st century cultural norms on Paul? We may be imposing our 21st century cultural norms on Paul, a Christian missionary in 1st century CE. He was living in 1st century CE while we are in 21st century CE. So from our 21st century CE's perspective, he might be very conservative, but in his own time, he might be very revolutionary. You see, who would still appear revolutionary to his contemporaries. We may not conclude from above passages that Paul either did or did not approve of such social practices. Paul may simply have found it unnecessary to challenge authoritarian structures because he thought that they would soon be gone. Yeah, in 1 Corinthians 7:31, he expressly encourages his readers to deal with the world as though they had no dealings with it, for the present form of this world is passing away. So from Paul's perspective, Jesus' second coming, parousia, was very imminent. Jesus is coming soon, and if that happens, then the whole world will pass away. In other words, you then have to spend time and energy renovating the current, the present form of the world. This is understandable. This is understandable. You know that Jesus is coming here soon in like a couple of days. Then you won't spend hard time studying, preparing for midterm exams or graduation, right? Similarly, if you know that Jesus is coming soon, then you won't spend too much time on renovating the current system of the world. Recently, certain texts from Galatians and 1 Corinthians have taken center stage in this ongoing interpretation of Paul's view on gender issues. Of crucial importance in this discussion has been Galatians 3:28. We discussed, right, the baptismal formula. Most argue that Paul used this fragment of a baptismal confession to subvert the attempt by Judaizing opponents to supplement his gospel with law observance for Gentiles. For Gentile believers as a precondition for participation in the church. So his gospel and law observance, the Judaizers want to have both, his gospel plus law observance. But Paul will say, no, this is not unnecessary. To make being a Jew the primary referent, Paul argued devalued. To make being a Jew the primary referent, devalued the adequacy of his gospel. ESF, Elizabeth Schuschler Fiorenza believes the phrase, there is no longer male or female, echoed Jesus' critique of patriarchal marriage, which by definition constructs and promotes a structure of dominance. According to ESF, Paul, however, compromised this radical imperative when he condemned Christian wives to silence in the worshiping church. This one, but we kind of conclude that this is an insertion. Later, insertion. Unmarried women were allowed to speak by default. They had no husband to ask or to speak for them. Thus, ESF sees a contradiction between the baptismal confession and 1 Corinthians 11, 2-16 and 14:34-46. But this one, mutuality, we said. This one, radical equality. And this one, later, insertion. So we may simply disregard at this moment. Fiorenza endorses the suggestion that Paul's attempt to put women in their places was a vestige of Paul's rabbinic prejudice. Daniel Boyarin sharply criticized her for her tacit approval of a view that traces Paul's chauvinism to an incompletely exorcised, demonized Jewish past. Daniel Boyarin, a famous Jewish rabbi, criticized that. So Paul's rabbinic prejudice that was still influencing on Paul's view of male and female, and Daniel Boyarin argued that that's not true. That's not true. While scholars in general agree that 1 Corinthians is a later addition inserted in an effort to bring Paul's view on gender into conformity with the Deuteropauline view of 1 Timothy 2:11-12. This is a Deuteropauline written by a student of Paul. It's not easy to find a resolution to the apparent contradiction between the liberation promised in Galatians 3:28 from all hierarchies and structures of inequality and the imposition of the hierarchies in 1 Corinthians 11. On the other hand, Paul plainly expects that women will take an active role in the worship and witness of the church. Euodia and Syntyche in Philippians 4:3 were influential women leaders collaborating with Paul. Phoebe served as a deacon. Prisca was probably a member of a female male missionary team and had risked her life for Paul. Junia was an apostle. Julia, the sister of nurses, were worthy of mention also. At least there are 9 women who played an important role in the mission and nature of the church. So in Paul's churches, women can become leaders, missionaries, and apostle. At least 9 women were mentioned in Paul's letters as important church leaders. So that means that Paul was not a chauvinist, but some sort of he was kind of arguing for equality in terms of gender. Okay, here to deny them voices historically in error. Clearly, Paul had a history of collaborating with women as well as men in the spread of the gospel. He has a history of collaborating with women as well as men. Men was important, but women was important as well for Paul in his ministry. Where does this discussion leave us? It's likely that Paul was neither a chauvinist nor a liberationist, but something in between. He was radical, but he was not completely a liberationist from our perspective. There are glimpses of an exciting new order in the letters of Paul. At the same time, however, some degree of subordination seems to be taken for granted in Paul's statement that man is the image and glory of God, but woman is the reflection of man. There is just a little bit of chauvinistic element. So in Paul, we find a mixture of the subversion of traditional hierarchical pattern as well as their reinforcement. Paul was a practical theologian. It would be remarkable indeed if Paul did not reflect some of the prejudices, superstition, and bias of his own time. He's a human being. Paul is a human being. He's not free from his own time. We all are not free from our own time. The question is, how much should we worry about Paul's cultural views? Does his unconsidered prejudice against women vitiate his eyes on Jesus and other important questions of life? Moreover, Paul's letters address a rather limited set of circumstances. It seems unfair to denounce him for not anticipating or addressing concerns that have only recently been raised to a high level of consciousness. This is again very important. It seems unfair to denounce him for not anticipating and addressing concerns that have only recently been raised to a high level of conscience. Only in 20th century CE, Western world allowed women to right to vote, right? And it took only in 20th century CE, Western world gave women to right to vote, and Paul was living in 1st century CE. We cannot expect him to be exactly like us. There is a 2,000-year difference. We should definitely avoid using Paul's apparent acceptance of discrimination in his day to justify discrimination in our own. So this is very significant, right? Paul's letter, women be silent, the addition. Therefore, you apply this one in a saying in 1st century CE to 21st century CE, saying women in 21st century CE should be silent. That's not right. This time this was a cultural norm in 1st century CE, but not in 21st CE. It's the gospel that Paul preaches rather than his limited application and witness to it. That is definitive for our time. So the gospel has its major content, and it has application, its major content and application to a certain culture. Obviously, Paul had the 1st century CE culture, and we cannot apply both to 21st century CE. This we have to apply, this maybe not. We may have to find a different way of applying the content of the Gospel of Paul to our situation. And that Gospel has far-reaching implications for the full and equal realizations of all human rights. Yeah, okay. So the content, the core message. What's the core message? Equality, right? Equality. Application was some sort of limitation. So we should pay attention to this value, while this one we have to modify or adjust a little bit according to our own cultural norms. Okay. I guess I'm done with what I expected, but one thing that I want to say here is, in Paul's time, Greco-Roman world was based upon Stoicism, and Stoics like Aristotle or Socrates, they taught a basic structure of three relations. That is free, slave, male, female, and adult and children. They will say men are born free and men are born slave. They say male has a better reason while female does not. They will say adult is mature, children is immature. So I will write this way. Okay, this is free, and this is slave. Free and slave. So free and slave. Oh, so free, you have reason. You possess reason. Slave, you have no reason. You are simply meant to be slave. And out of free, you have male and female. Yeah, male and female both have a reason. A male person has a ruling reason, while female has ruled reason. So male do have particular types of reason that allows you to rule. So you are the ones who will control. Female. Female has a ruled reason, so you have to be ruled. In other words, you know, the structure should be like that, not like this. And at the same time, adult, you are mature. Children, immature. So you are not, adult is a human being, but children, you are not complete. You know, you have to wait until you become an adult. So this is the basic structure. You know, if you are a slave, male or female, you know, you have no reason. You know, you are not supposed to think or say or talk back again. Talk back to your master. So let's say there is a theater here, and then show is happening. Then what will be the, and this is amphitheater, what will be the situation of sitting? Usually, let's say, you know, this is the sphere for free, and probably male will sit here, and female will sit here, and children may be here. And slave, you have to stand somewhere behind. So this is the cultural understanding of male, female, children, and slave. How about Paul? Paul will say, you know, male, female, cooperation, master and slave, brothers, parents, take good care of your children in God's love and patience. This teaching of Paul may not be quite revolutionary to our ears because, you know, these are what we presuppose. But in 1st century CE, who are familiar with this structure, you know, from 1st century CE person's perspective who are familiar with this structure, they will find that, you know, Paul is pretty liberationist. Yes, you know, Paul didn't challenge them enough. However, he was already attacking that system in his own way. Okay, so in my opinion, Paul is quite a revolutionary and liberationist in terms of gender and sex. And thank you very much, guys. I will see you again next week. All right.